The definition of the city that I like most is the definition that says the city is the place where you find what you are not looking for.
A city is a complex but incomplete space.
Well, the thing that distinguishes a city from just a place which has got lots of people living close together is that those different groups interact.
Most people making decisions in cities don't get it. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of bringing a whole new field that understands the social processes and the physical process at the same time.
L'environnement favorable nécessitant donc des cadres juridiques adéquats.
Document that's in front of all of us, the new urban agenda.
Different countries have different realities and dynamics.
Cities are going to take the action because governments are sclerotic.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The presentation tonight really touches, as you can see, on three massive themes of importance for Habitat 3, which is how do you actually design cities in the wider sense of the word, not just physical design, but governance, and also how does one relate to environmental, ecological, social, and economic issues.
Hablar de la ciudad hoy no es solamente hablar de la ciudad, es hablar de una pérdida masiva de hábitat.
El futuro no está predeterminado. No estamos castigados a tener mala ciudad de una forma determinística.
2.5 years ago, one close and I were having a drink, and I asked him, have you read the Charter of Athens? This enormously influential document.
To explain the Charter of Athens, which was more or less conceived in 1933 on a great ship going across the Mediterranean, you've got to probably go back a little bit more to understand context. The early part of the 20th century was thought of as the machine age. New forms of production were coming into process, affecting everyone's lives. The car was beginning to dominate the way we moved around in cities and in the world.
They had a dream, and that dream was that a city could be organized to work like a beautiful machine.
We've got to remember that then, in the 1930s, the city was seen as overcrowded, dark, and actually negative in terms of well-being. So if you believe in the machine age, if you believe in rationalist principles, what do? You clean it up. And you do that by taking all the different functions and separating them out. You put people to sleep there, and you put people to work there, and you go and entertain yourself there. You connect them by nice motorways with cars. That's a view of what Le Corbusier imagined for Paris, making the city as a machine, putting people in towers, and having a cruciform shape so that you could get fresh air and improve the health of the people there. What was actually ruined in that process was the street, was the continuity and the sense of cohesion.
The problems today that we have in urbanism is that we design cities to be closed in the sense that there's a tight bond between form and function in how people experience the city.
I would say that most of the principles of the 30s Charter are still quite dominant. The notion that there's a CBD somewhere, a central business district, then out there are towers of housing, all linked by large freeways and motorways. Those more or less are the principles of the Charter of Athens from 70 years ago. Even though arguments about sustainability, arguments about social cohesion, arguments about integration really should be taking the city in the opposite direction.
Confronted with some of these trends, I like to ask, who owns the city? In the city, those without power can stand up and say, we're present, that this is also our city. That is, to me, what marks the city, and that is why mere built-up density is not a city, and we need to protect that distinction.
A successful public space has to bring people together. There has to be fizz of interaction.
Once we accept that in the city, to have a decent life, we require a lot of commons. That the public land ends up being something between 60 or 70% of the total land of the city, which is very counterintuitive to the ones that they think that the market is governing urbanization. What governs the quality of good urban life is the provision of public land.
The beginning of creating an open city is to protect the public realm as something that belongs to the public, to resist the privatization of public space. Most of the public space in most cities is streets. It's a common good. Under kind of neoliberal capitalism, we've lost the notion that the public belongs to the public.
The last 30 years, what we see is the rise of logics of extraction, away from the dominance of mass consumption, which meant that even the most aggressive corporation or bank was interested in the sons and daughters of the middle classes doing better than their parents. When you switch to the dominance of a logic of extraction, none of that matters.
It's very difficult for the private owner to understand that the provision of public space is fundamental and in fact generates private value. The market is not a good urban planner.
When you see that the dominant logic is a logic of extraction, that means concentration, concentration, concentration. So this particular period has generated its own undoing, because in the end, you keep extracting, there's not much left.
The public realm is not something that simply can be reduced to profit and loss.
The Charter of Athens model is of great interest to the private sector. in terms of promoting land investment or speculation. It's a very easy way to deal with cities, rather than this messy, organic, integrated way that we might find in pre-existing cities that have been there a long time and require much more negotiation. Expansion of cities is important as long as they're well planned. Well planned doesn't mean making an instant perfect city. It means providing the infrastructure of a messy and incremental city. Unless you get the physical infrastructure right, you don't get the potential for equity right.
The question of the equitable city is a difficult one. How can we make an intervention that alters the dominance of this logic of extraction? So for me, one of them is the importance of relocalizing pieces of the economy that today are basically exist as elements of franchises. So my rhetorical question there is always, do we really need a multinational corporation to have a cup of coffee? We need to find the way that whatever the consumption capacity of these modest neighborhoods, which is most of the neighborhoods in the world, whatever it is, we should maximize its recirculation.
This permanent effort to make the city a just place where every innovation is not owned by a minority and denied to the rest, or used by a minority to make more money.
There are lots of things we can do to bring an open city into being, to overlay different kinds of functions in the city so that they synergize.
The political classes, they need to enable a better distribution of the wealth that is getting produced. Because the mechanisms that lead to concentration at the top, we made those mechanisms. They did not fall from the sky. We altered the law. Those were critical decisions that were made in legislatures, that were made by the executive branch, that were made by judges, that were made, in a variety of settings. That needs to be changed.
Going in the opposite direction from the Charter of Athens actually means understanding what density, complexity, and overlapping of different functions, so that you have something happening in the city at different times of day and night for different people, the open city, not a closed, walled place where people of difference can't come together.
The open city is based on the notion that an environment becomes more and more complex. And how do you manage it rather than try and simplify it?
There are three basic concepts behind this. One is, as Richard Sennett calls it, the openness of a city. How open can you make a city? In other words, not close it down for different, distinct groups who never mix. The second is Saskia Sassen's argument, which is about ownership. Who owns the city? How do we actually give it back to different constituents and not give in to what is now the trend in many cities around the world of large companies, corporations taking over major chunks? And thirdly is, I guess, my contribution to the discussion, which is that design really matters. It's not just a question of planning, it's not just a question of zoning and regulations. It's the quality, it's the section of the street. How wide a street? How tall are the buildings?
The reason for opening up the city is ultimately that this is how you keep a place alive.